Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sally Stang, the Housing and Community Services Director for the City of Wichita. Today, we're here to talk about Wichita's Emergency Rental Assistance Program and the Eviction Moratorium. I'm joined by Nate from Kansas Legal Services. If you have any questions about rental assistance or the moratorium, please share them in the comments section. We'll be answering them later in the broadcast. Nate?
Just happy to be here. Thanks so much for allowing Kansas Legal Services to participate in this presentation. We've been doing quite a bit of work with the city trying to facilitate the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, but nothing, of course, that the work you all have been doing. Just happy to help spread the word about some of the moratoriums in place and other legal options for people that maybe are facing eviction somewhat soon.
Yes, definitely. Well, thank you so much for being here and bearing with us as we try to get this organized. So it has been great. So the Wichita Emergency Rental Assistance Program we lovingly call WERAP. The program is a rent and utility assistance program for income-eligible individuals and families that have been directly or indirectly affected by COVID-19. And the funding for this program came from both the Coronavirus Act under President Trump and the American Rescue Plan Act under President Biden. And it comes to us from the Department of Treasury. And it has really specific requirements for households to be eligible. So they have to households have to have an income at or below 80% of the area median income. They must have been directly or indirectly affected by COVID-19, be housing unstable, must be renting, and for our program must live within the Wichita city limits. Outside of the city of Wichita, the Kansas Housing Resource Corporation is operating the Kansas Eviction Rental Assistance Program, and applications can be submitted to their program online. But also to help people in knowing whether or not they live within the city limits of Wichita, there's a handy little tool on the city's website that it's called the Find My Council Member tool. If you go to that area on wichita.gov, type in your address, it'll tell you who your council member is. If it comes back with no council member, that means you don't live in the city limits. So, we also are required by regulation to provide a preference or priority to households that either have an income that's below 50% of the area median income, or those applicants who were previously employed and have been unemployed for the 90 days prior to application. So although they have to have an income of 80% AMI or lower to qualify, in order to get that preference, they need to either be under 50% area median income or unemployed for 90 days. And those income levels can actually be found on the WERAP program website at wichita.gov / WERAP. So we also wanted to talk about the eviction moratoriums, and I want to turn that over to Nate to give you some background here.
Thank you, Sally. And just a quick overview, we don't have a ton of time left with these eviction moratoriums, but they've been a very important part of the eviction landscape for a while. And as relates to rental assistance, the fact that the moratoriums were in place was a big reason why I think the federal and state governments want to facilitate rental assistance. Landlords haven't been paid in quite a while. Tenants are facing a pretty large backlog of rent. So the rental assistance hopefully can fill the gaps left because the moratoriums have been in place since about September 2020. I'll go into a bit more detail later, but I'll focus on the federal eviction moratorium. There was one in the state of Kansas I'll touch on briefly, but it expired at the end of May. The federal moratorium's expiring at the end of June, but we will still have some legal consequences from this moratorium that interplay some with the rental assistance process that landlords and tenants should think through if they're facing the eviction process.
Through that pretty quickly. Wow.
And I can go through the slides. I thought I was going through them in more detail a little bit later.
Okay, not a problem. So as far as WERAP is concerned, we've received more than 3,900 applications to date. And staff is working diligently to process them as quickly as possible. Oftentimes, some of the barriers we have to the application process is incomplete applications. We reviewed, once we pulled the first 1,000 applications and reviewed them, we only had one application that had actually submitted all of the documentation requested on the application. So it is a lot of back and forth between staff and the applicant to make sure that we are getting all of the documentation required. And so one of the requirements is to be income eligible. And so the Treasury, the Department of Treasury, has given us guidance that says we have two options for determining whether or not someone is income eligible. We can use the 2020 1040 tax form filed by all members of the household, covered by, or we can use the reviewing current income. 60 days is what we review to determine what a person's current income can be. And that flexibility is great in that it allows us, if someone had a decent job in 2020 and lost it in June, right, and had significant earnings and then went on unemployment, they could have significant income on their 1040 tax form, but yet currently be hurting because they're only receiving their unemployment, or their unemployment has since expired and not receiving anything. So to just look at the 2020 income would be a disservice to the household. So our other option is to review 60 days of income. But that's 60 days of income for all household members. So it is collecting check stubs and Social Security statements and bank statements for every member of the household. And that can be a lot of back and forth because we're missing documents. We can also, some of our other barriers we've run into have to do with the application, and the people who are listed on the application don't match the people on the lease. And so then we need to get back with the landlord and the tenant to get either a lease amendment that clearly shows that the people who are supposed to be living in the unit are living in the unit, and that we've verified the income of all household members. We've run across issues in ownership. Oftentimes people don't really know who their landlord is. And we jokingly laugh because once in a while we'll get an application and it's who's your landlord, and it's like Hector, with no phone number, no address, no email address. And so we resort to going to the appraiser's website. And of course, what do we get on the appraiser's website but an LLC and an address? No phone number, no email address. So we are really trying to hunt and peck to find out who legally owns the property and has right to collect rent for that property. So those are the kind of things that we run into more often than I would have ever thought. So it's the processing of applications is definitely more time consuming than I would have predicted. That's for sure. But we know that with the eviction moratorium coming to a close, it's so important that we try and process applications as quickly as possible because, we're hearing a lot about the potential tsunami of evictions, as we've heard that term. Nate, anything else that you want to add related to the potential impact of that federal moratorium coming to an end?
Oh, of course. And maybe give a bit more background after forcing you through the slides so quickly before. No and I'll admit on our side, it's usually a little bit easier to figure out who the landlord is if we're defending against an eviction. They send us those papers straight up. So, I can assist some with this moratorium stuff. As I mentioned at the top, we did have a state eviction moratorium. Governor Kelly instituted that before the federal moratorium was put in place, but it has been rescinded on May 28th. The state Legislative Coordinating Council rescinded Executive Order 2113. Have some information on the slides if anyone would like, I guess, a historical record of it at this point. Wichita, and this question has come up sometimes, there's not any local moratorium on evictions as well. So what we're left with at this point, at least for a few more weeks, a couple weeks, I guess, we're midway through June now, is the federal eviction moratorium that was put in place by the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. This was a temporary halt on evictions. The idea was that if people are evicted from their home, it could lead to a greater spread of COVID, not something anybody wanted during the pandemic. So instead, a moratorium was put in place where renters did not have to continue to pay rent while facing the threat of eviction. Rent continues to back up. That amount is due now that we're closing at the end of the moratorium, which is why rental assistance is so important. But the moratorium has been vital in preventing just, as you put it, a tsunami of evictions during the pandemic when people lost income because of a job, were laid off, had extreme, substantial out-of-pocket medical expenses. And the moratorium, both at the state and federal level, have been very important to prevent just thousands of evictions probably in the state of Kansas. But now we are potentially facing those. But even with a couple weeks left, I did want to spend a little bit of time discussing who does qualify for the moratorium, not only because we got a couple weeks left, but there is a possibility that the moratorium at the federal level might be extended depending on how the federal government evaluates rental assistance programs happening throughout the country. Under the federal moratorium, it applies to anyone who falls as a covered person, which is not a very helpful term. Covered person means everybody's covered who gives a declaration to their landlord that's signed under penalty of perjury. What does that declaration say? Well, the CDC has very helpfully put together a sample for everyone and lays out in checkbox form the things that you have to do to qualify. And they'll sound very similar to what's happening with WERAP, with income qualifications and demonstrations of lost income. Here, for the eviction moratorium to be covered, you have to demonstrate you're using your best efforts to obtain government assistance or housing. Under the Kansas moratorium, before it expired, there was an explicit qualification that you had to seek rental assistance through the state agency. Your income has to be less than $99,000 per year, a little bit higher than the amounts we're dealing with in Wichita. And there's automatic qualification, though, if you did receive a stimulus payment or some other government income-based assistance during the past year or two. The tenant must also demonstrate or at least declare that they're unable to make rent because they've been laid off, because they've lost income, or face those out-of-pocket medical expenses that I mentioned before. Usually it has to be pandemic related, although there are a few courts that have interpreted it that as long as you lost some income, even if it's not due to the pandemic, you qualify for the eviction moratorium. Though here in Wichita, courts have tended to apply it more to loss of income due to the pandemic. At the same time, the tenant should show that they're making their best efforts at partial payments, and if they were evicted, they would face homelessness or at least very close quarters that risk the spread of COVID. As noted, though, after going through all that, the current order does expire on June 30th, so we've only got a couple weeks left. At that time, landlords will be legally allowed to begin pursuing evictions because of non-payment of rent, which is something really that's not happened much since September of last year. We've had quite a few different kinds of evictions otherwise. The moratorium doesn't apply to, for example, if your lease was just terminated because it ends, or you're on a month-to-month tenancy and maybe your landlord terminated it with proper 30 days notice. Most courts have said that the eviction moratorium does not apply there. But we're also facing a situation where some federal courts have struck down the moratorium on the whole, claiming that it's beyond the power of the CDC. The law that the CDC used is a bit more about quarantining people than it is about a housing eviction moratorium across the country. There is a ruling in federal court that has struck it down. It was stayed on appeal. But because of that legal challenge, we believe it's unlikely the Biden administration will attempt to pursue it again, and we haven't seen much congressional appetite to extend it through September either. So this June 30th date is coming up relatively quick, which will make focusing on rental assistance incredibly important.
Grants. And this new funding that we've received is really different than anything we've ever had in the past, and it is going to make significant differences in people's lives. So the program not only allows us to assist households in getting caught up with their arrears, qualified households can also be qualified for future rent payments. So unlike other programs in the past, such as KEP, which was a state-run program, or the EAP program that Wichita ran for a period that had a dollar amount threshold, the WERAP program has a term limitation, not a dollar amount limitation. And so under the federal regulations, we can provide up to 12 months assistance, actually 15 months worth of assistance, if it is necessary for a household to be able to remain housing stable, right? And so in each individual circumstance, we may be going back 3 months for arrears, which then could qualify the family for up to 9 months going forward if there's still a financial need. So that is a huge difference between this program and other programs that have happened in the past. And it's also another reason why, I get asked, once the moratorium expires, what's going to encourage landlords to keep people in their units? And part of that is the availability of this resource, because not only if they continue to allow that tenancy to continue, we can pay those arrears, but then there's that guaranteed money going forward. Now, of course, for future rent assistance payments, every 90 days we have to recertify that the client is still eligible, that there's still need, but that's definitely built into our processes. This is really an opportunity to stabilize families that have been hurting for a very, very long time. And in addition, we're able to use some of the funding for what we call housing stability services, and that's something that we're just standing up right now. When this funding became available, our first priority was, let's get applications open as soon as possible. Let's try to get money flowing, and we will, and I've said it before, build the airplane while we're flying it. We will continuously be making changes to our policies, our procedures, trying to have more lean processes so that we can process applications faster. So this housing stability idea was kind of the second step in it. Once we got things rolling and computer systems in place and staff hired and training done, now we're like, okay, how do we address folks who unfortunately were evicted or forced to at least ended before we were able to assist them. So we do have hiring designated staff that can work with those families to try and get them into new housing. And then we can assist them going forward. So they may not be in a lease right now because it either expired or unfortunately they were evicted or just felt pressured and left. We found a lot of that. Our caseworkers can work with those families, try and secure or locate new housing, help them with security deposits and get set up so that they can be stable moving forward. So it's just it is absolutely amazing. It's a lot of work to qualify families, but once they get qualified, for them and us, because we're like, we need, more documents. We need your full lease. We need your, your income documentation. We need your utility bills and the breakdown of your utilities, because it's not just rent, it is also utility assistance. It is a lot of work to get all that information in. Once they get it in, it can provide them such a tremendous benefit that can help stabilize their family going forward. It's also, one of the complaints that we heard was the fact that our program doesn't necessarily won't pay a landlord if the client has left or been evicted, right? But part of that is we need to encourage landlords to keep their residents. Hold on, help is coming, because if we made payments after they vacated, there'd be no encouragement for the landlord to keep the resident if they were going to get paid anyway. The same holds true on the tenant side of the world too, right? If they hold on, because the landlord said to me, well, you're giving the tenant all the power because they could walk away and stick me with this debt even though I've been patient. And it's like, yeah, it could happen. But that debt will follow them because, again, if they're not in a tenancy, we're not paying it. So it actually can help encourage the resident to not just, skip from the unit, because they'll have that debt that follows them and make it that much more challenging in the future for them to find another rental. So it is a tough scenario. It seems a little mean to say, nope, that tenancy doesn't exist, we're not paying on it anymore. But in the end, it is really a means for us to try and encourage those tenancies to continue and keep people stable. Now, that doesn't mean that the resident is trapped. Once we get them caught up, if they decide that they want to move and terminate their lease at the end of the term, we can assist them in a new rental elsewhere too. So it's not that they're necessarily trapped in that scenario. So,
but like the moratorium, and the idea behind rental assistance is to provide some stability to people, and I think that maybe ties into how the federal moratorium, or just the state one now that both are close to expiration or have expired already, might tie together with rental assistance as we face some of these eviction cases moving forward. So once the moratorium's done, obviously its legal effects, its direct effects on these eviction cases, landlords, tenants, will expire as well. But it is tied together with rental assistance. So if a landlord pursues a tenant for payment of rent because they're thousands of dollars behind, let's say the tenant has been working for a couple months with WeWrap to get money to their landlord, we're investigating the position, and we view it over at Kansas Legal Services as that might violate a landlord's duty to mitigate damages. In Kansas, normally, once a tenant has been evicted or said that they've abandoned the property, there's an obligation or duty on the landlord to find another tenant instead of imposing all of the new rent that might be due upon the old tenant. And that comes from a kind of broader contractual principle where an injured party in a contract, in this case the landlord who hasn't been paid, has to make some reasonable attempts to mitigate their damages. And we believe that if they're not waiting on rental assistance, waiting on these thousands of dollars that may come and help mitigate their damages substantially, that might be a violation of that duty to mitigate and really undercut their ability to get that money as a damages claim in an eviction proceeding like you normally would. So this money provides, I think, a lot of incentive to both sides where the tenant is able to avoid maybe thousands of dollars of debt and all of the attendant consequences of that on their record, while the landlord might actually get paid, which is not something we often see in eviction proceedings.
Sure. That's a lot of stuff going on for sure. And so we, as I said before, we continue to, update our procedures and our processes. We are keeping the landlord more in the loop. They get a weekly update of their status of their client. When we're sending information about missing information, we include the landlord so that they're aware of what it is that we might be missing, so that they know where they are in the process. They can always reach out to the WeWrap email. That's the easiest way to get information, is at WeWrap at wichita.gov and ask for a status update, and we have staff that can respond and give them an update as to where things are. So that kind of wraps up what we had to present, and we wanted to open it up for some questions.
All right, thanks, Sally. If you could just go over a little bit for me, who is eligible for the program?
Sure. Eligible for the program are households that are below 80% area median income, that have been directly or indirectly impacted by COVID-19. They're housing unstable, which generally means that they have arrears. They're being threatened with evictions. Or they have late utility payments that if they don't pay their utilities, they could in turn then still also be evicted. They must be renting. They can't be homeowners. And they have to live within the Wichita city limits. So to qualify for the program, that's pretty much it in a nutshell. We do offer those two preferences that are mandated by the Department of Treasury, that we first serve those households that are under 50% area median income or have been unemployed for the 90 days prior to application.
Great. And how long from submitting their application can renters expect to receive payment?
That's definitely a tricky question because we received over 1,400 applications in the first 7 days. And then we received about 1,400 applications in the whole month of March. So as you can imagine, it's coming down, the number of applications that we're receiving. We're averaging about 12 a day now. So if you applied in that first 7 days, we just got to you a couple of weeks ago. We're now working on applications that were submitted by March 9th. That sounds like a lot. It's been 3 months. But we're definitely seeing, because the number of applications that were coming in started to slow down, that we're able to move faster and faster. It's really challenging because someone who provides almost all of their documentation can be approved pretty quickly. And then we have others that, unfortunately, it's been 6 weeks of back and forth saying, you're missing this, you're missing this. Third request for that same information. We did recently change our policies and procedures because we were seeing too many households were stretching it out that long, that we're now have lessen the amount of time people have to submit the documents. And unless they have a technological or reasonable accommodation need, we're giving them 7 days to return the documents. And that we are seeing things starting to process faster because of that. And it's not all lost. If for some reason they can reapply, we don't.
Yeah.
If they had to be removed because they didn't submit the documents requested after 3 or 4 requests, they can definitely reapply, and that has happened.
You mentioned that some of the information is missing. What types of information are you seeing most often is missing from these applications?
Often it's not complete information. So, if we're not using the 1040 tax form method, we have to have 60 days worth of income. So if you're paid weekly, that's 8 or 9 check stubs. If you're paid biweekly, it's 4 or 5, depending on, where your pay period is there. There may be different terms for different members of the family. If you have people, members on Social Security, it's a monthly Social Security check. We need that documentation showing what that, is. Some people don't think or know that they have to provide that documentation, even for minors, because by the regulations, unearned income of minors still counts towards household income. The full copy of the lease, the reason we ask that is because the landlord is going to ask for different fees, and if they're not covered in the lease, we don't pay them. And we've had landlords who've created creative fees recently in their requests for repayment that aren't covered in the lease. But we also need to verify if the household composition is, consistent with the application. So we need that full copy of the lease. Oftentimes people are submitting just the first page. And it's like, this
Shows
doesn't
they
even
live there.
Yeah, it doesn't even cover what rent is. So we do ask that full lease be submitted with the documents. We have changed, we've adjusted as we've gone along and implemented some streamlined abilities that are now allowed by the Treasury, such as we can now accept a self-declaration of the COVID-related impact. Now, for the first couple of months, actually through March 7th, we were required to get documentation of that COVID-related impact. So if someone was laid off, we needed documentation from the business. And sometimes that was a challenge because the business shut down, right? It's like, how do you get documentation that when you can't get a hold of the business? So that was a significant change, and we implemented that change almost immediately after guidance came out from Treasury saying that we could accept a self-certification of that COVID-related impact. So that's definitely helped. One last thing that we have to verify. So,
if an applicant submits all of the correct paperwork on the first go, how long should they expect to be paid?
Well, it's not just the applicant. So it can also depend on whether or not the landlord is an established vendor within the city system. So the same day that we notify an applicant that their application has been pulled from the waiting list, the landlord gets an email, an update that says, hey, your tenant has been pulled from the waiting list. Here's a landlord declaration. So this is something we adjusted to in May, where we, like I said, we were just getting ledgers and information kind of haphazardly from the landlord by reaching out. Now they get an email that has a link to a landlord certification form that they fill out, certifying who lives in the property, how much rent is owed, what the breakdown, what months is owed, that they're going to continue to allow the resident to stay in the unit once they've accepted, assistance, some other declarations. But it's with that document, we ask the question if they're already a vendor or not with the city of Wichita. And if they're not, it actually allows them to download the required forms and submit them right with the declaration. Sometimes we've had it take several weeks after we've determined a household eligible to have the landlord submit the documents and get set up as a vendor, unfortunately. So it can really depend. If the application, once we get the information and can verify that the household is eligible, we make sure that the landlord's submitted their documents as a vendor. It doesn't take long to get payments queued up in the system.
Yeah. Nate, earlier in the broadcast, you mentioned that some people might not know who their landlord is there a way that they can easily find out who their landlord might be?
Easily is probably no, unfortunately. Although, and when I was alluding to that before, a lot of times the cases that we have are a situation where someone's facing eviction already. So they'll have gotten a summons from the court with an attorney listed that identifies the party that is either their corporate or personal landlord. I think often, though, you've got to try to communicate with your property manager. A lot of times that might be one person who is working for a larger corporation and covering a fairly large community. I think the more difficult situations are where it's an individual, maybe that only owns one or two properties. There are things like you can look up the Register of Deeds to see maybe who actually owns the property, and that's something I do quite a bit, checking out that part of the Sedgwick County website. And that's one way to do it, although maybe someone's managing it that's different than on the deed, but at least you'll have somebody to talk to. And really, a lot of times it comes down to who's sending you notices and who's asking for money as the easiest way that we can figure it out.
Thank you. I think you answered this earlier in the broadcast, but is this program just for residential renters, or could homeowners or small business owners who rent their property use this as well?
Sure, yeah, the federal regulations limit our ability to use this. It is absolutely just for residential tenancies. We cannot assist homeowners, we cannot assist small businesses with this funding.
What about unhoused residents? Could someone who is currently experiencing homelessness use this to find a rental property?
Unfortunately, the Department of Treasury was very specific in their frequently asked questions and deemed this is an eviction prevention program, and that someone who isn't currently housed is not facing eviction and therefore is not eligible under this program. But we do have other programs within the city, within the community, that can assist those who are experiencing homelessness.
If I might suggest too, hopefully, and something we're working on over at KLS is keeping an eye on mortgage assistance for homeowners. Some of that has been authorized through the most recent stimulus, but there's been several rounds of applying to get the money from the state and has taken even longer than rental assistance. But homeowners, small businesses should be on the lookout for similar sorts of things like those facing homelessness as well.
Absolutely.
We also got a question earlier. If a resident has to be of legalized status to apply for this program?
So no, there is no requirement for us to review eligible immigration status. Although the application asks the question, we do have to collect it and report on it, just like we do other demographic information, such as race and ethnicity, but we don't screen by it. There's nothing in the language of this program that requires us to screen by it.
Great. Could you speak a little bit about why the city felt it was important to facilitate our own program locally? You talked a little bit about the state-run program. Why did we feel that it was important for our residents to help facilitate this locally?
Sure. The regulations allowed municipalities with more than 300,000 people to get their own direct allocation rather than going through the state. And when we were made aware that we could get a direct allocation, we had the discussion and said, well, who knows our residents and our landlords better than us? We operate a robust rental assistance program with the Section 8 voucher program. We have thousands of landlords that are already vendors within the city system. We know many of these properties. We inspect them. We're there often. And, we have a whole list of people that are assisting us in doing this. We are utilizing the neighborhood resource centers. Anyone can go into a neighborhood resource center and get assistance in applying or in submitting documents. I sent someone today to the recommended she go to the Colvin Neighborhood Resource Center because we were missing some documents and she wasn't sure how she could get them to us. And within 20 minutes, the Neighborhood Resource Center reached out and said, do you want these going directly to you, or you want them to, I was like,
That's what you want to hear.
This is working really great. We have somebody at the Workforce Alliance that is working with us and really trying to get in front of people. Sometimes that's that same population. Those who are now looking for work and going to the Workforce Alliance are also the ones who could have been impacted by COVID and why they lost their job to begin with. So we have someone at the Workforce Alliance that's designated to help people complete those applications, get that information in. We immediately started sending staff over to the eviction court and had them posted there to try and intercept and intercede and let landlords know this was available, let clients know. It's a short turnaround time, but we did have quite a few that came back and said, if we can get them onto the list for this program, we're going to not necessarily move forward with this eviction. So we felt boots on the ground was really important. And then, we've been able to hire, at this point, 13 additional full-time staff through the temp service agency. We're hiring 4 more permanent, semi-permanent housing staff that'll be working through housing stability. That's just an economic driver for our community, putting people to work right here in Wichita rather than having it all run through Topeka.
And anecdotally, y'all have been much more communicative than the state agency, not to cause any trouble or, anyone I'm working with at the state level, but, it's just, I think you hit on it really well. Knowing the people that you're working with definitely helps. And we were very happy to see you posting up at eviction court too. I know that provided a much different atmosphere than usually happens over there.
Yes.
All right, that's all that I have for you today.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for tuning in. We will be doing a second Facebook Live on Friday with more of a landlord focus. Please feel free to join us then. Submit your questions ahead of time if you like. Submit questions anytime you like related to WERAP at werap@wichita.gov. And have a great day. Thank you so much.